The sound of someone hammering at 7 a.m. on a Saturday is never a welcome alarm clock. I rolled over, pulling my pillow over my head, convinced I was dreaming. The rhythmic pounding continued, now accompanied by what sounded like multiple voices shouting instructions. I dragged myself out of bed and shuffled to my kitchen to make coffee, the essential first step of my weekend ritual. As the machine gurgled to life, I glanced out my kitchen window and froze. People, at least a dozen, were setting up what appeared to be an elegant white canopy in my backyard. White folding chairs were being arranged in neat rows, and a man was literally hammering a floral arch into my carefully cultivated flower bed. I blinked hard, wondering if I was still dreaming. I threw on yesterday's jeans and a semi-clean t-shirt before bursting through my back door. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice cracking from sleep and confusion. "What's happening here?" A woman in her early 30s with a clipboard and a Bluetooth earpiece looked up, annoyed at the interruption. Her perfectly styled hair didn't move in the morning breeze, and her business casual attire seemed absurdly formal for what appeared to be manual labor supervision. She gave me a quick once-over, clearly unimpressed by my disheveled appearance. "You must be Mark," she said, consulting her clipboard with an exaggerated sigh. "Mrs. Whitmore informed us you'd been notified weeks ago. We're setting up for the Whitmore vow renewal ceremony. Is there a problem?" She spoke with the practiced patience of someone used to dealing with difficult people, which I apparently now was. Behind her, workers continued to transform my sanctuary into a wedding venue, completely oblivious to my growing horror. "Yes, there's a problem," I spluttered, watching in horror as another worker dragged an extension cord across my koi pond, nearly toppling the small stone lantern I'd positioned just so for evening meditation. "This is my private property. I never agreed to this. Who authorized you to be here?" My heart raced as I surveyed the destruction. The native wildflower patch that had taken 2 growing seasons to establish was now half buried under equipment. The meditation bench I'd handcrafted from reclaimed wood was being used as a platform for stacking chairs. The woman, her badge read Alexis, event coordinator, sighed dramatically and shifted her weight to one hip. "Mrs. Whitmore has all the proper HOA approval forms. The property lines technically include this green space as a shared beautification area. If you have concerns, you'll need to take them up with her." She turned away, already barking orders into her headset about centerpiece placement and lighting arrangements. "No, the peonies go on the guest tables, not the buffet tables. Did you even read the layout diagram?" That's when I spotted Karen Whitmore herself, directing workers to move my handcrafted garden bench into my garage. She stood near the edge of what had once been my sanctuary, pointing imperiously at my lovingly created possessions as if they were yard sale cast-offs. Her blonde hair was pulled back in an immaculate chignon, not a strand out of place despite the early hour. Her casual designer outfit probably cost more than 3 months of my mortgage payments. "That looks hideous there," she was saying, pointing at the bench I'd spent 3 weekends building, sanding by hand until my fingers blistered because power tools would disturb the birds nesting nearby. "It ruins the aesthetic. Put it in the garage or something." Our eyes met across the yard, and she gave me that saccharine smile that had become the harbinger of misery for our entire neighborhood. She abandoned the workers to glide across what remained of my lawn, her expensive flats somehow not sinking into the morning damp soil. "Mark, good morning. Isn't this exciting? Your backyard is going to be featured in the neighborhood newsletter." Her voice carried a rehearsed enthusiasm that didn't reach her calculating eyes. She placed a manicured hand briefly on my arm as though we were old friends sharing a delightful surprise. "I knew you wouldn't mind helping the community. After all, what's the point of having such a lovely space if it can't be shared?" The question was rhetorical, delivered with enough sugar-coated venom to make it clear that refusal wasn't an option she'd considered. 3 years ago, I'd purchased this modest 3-bedroom ranch house after a particularly spectacular burnout at my corporate marketing job. The 60-hour work weeks, toxic management, and constant pressure had landed me in the hospital with stress-induced arrhythmia, and my doctor's advice had been unambiguous: change your life or dramatically shorten it. So I'd cashed out my 401k, accepted a significant pay cut to work remotely as a freelance tech consultant, and sought out a quiet place to rebuild my health and life. The selling point hadn't been the house itself, which needed work, but the large, neglected backyard that backed up to a small wooded area. It offered privacy, potential, and most importantly, peace and quiet. The listing agent had apologetically mentioned the HOA, but assured me they were reasonable and just maintained property values. Those would prove to be the most expensive lies I'd ever believed. During my first month, I'd receive violation notices for my mailbox, wrong shade of black, my recycling bin visible from the street on a non-collection day, and my front door wreath, unauthorized seasonal decoration outside of the approved holiday schedule. The citations came with helpful photos marking the infractions in bright red circles and passive-aggressive notes about community standards and consideration for neighbors, but I'd adapted, following their ridiculous rules for the front of my house while pouring my energy into transforming my backyard into a private sanctuary. If I had to live with Soviet-level conformity in public, I would create my own paradise in private. I'd spent countless weekends turning the overgrown mess into a peaceful garden retreat. The process had been therapeutic, almost meditative. Each weekend for nearly a year, I'd wake at dawn and work until sunset, the physical labor helping to rebuild not just the garden, but my own mental health. I'd researched extensively, consulting with local nurseries about which plants would thrive in our climate and soil conditions. I'd cleared invasive species battling particularly stubborn patches of kudzu that had nearly taken over the back fence, and replanted with native flowers that supported local pollinators. The transformation was gradual but rewarding. What began as occasional butterfly visits soon became a bustling ecosystem of beneficial insects, birds, and even the occasional rabbit whose nibbling I tolerated as part of nature's balance. I'd installed a small koi pond, each stone placed by hand after careful consideration of both aesthetics and function. The designing process alone had taken 3 weeks. Sketching different layouts, researching proper depth requirements for fish health, and sourcing stones from a local quarry that provided the perfect weathered look I wanted. The gentle waterfall that fed the pond required precise engineering to create just the right sound profile. Enough water movement to provide ambient sound that masked neighborhood noise without being so loud as to become intrusive itself. I'd introduced the fish gradually, starting with just 3 small koi that had grown surprisingly large and been joined by several companions when a neighbor moving cross-country couldn't take their pond inhabitants with them. Solar-powered lanterns strategically placed throughout the garden created gentle lighting for evening reading sessions without contributing to light pollution. I'd built discrete stone platforms for each light, ensuring they would be at just the right height for optimal illumination without creating harsh shadows or glare. A small paved area, made from reclaimed brick I'd personally cleaned and reset, held my handcrafted meditation bench. That bench represented 3 months of woodworking classes at the community college, my first attempt at craftsmanship since high school shop class. It wasn't perfect, with slightly uneven joints and a finish that revealed my amateur status, but it was mine, positioned precisely to catch the morning sun through a gap in the eastern trees. I'd even installed a rain collection system, 3 connected barrels with a filtration mechanism and solar-powered pump that minimized water usage while keeping my plants healthy during dry spells. The local garden club had actually asked to tour my setup as an example of sustainable gardening practices, though I'd politely declined, preferring to maintain my privacy. This space had become my salvation, the place where I recovered from burnout and rebuilt my life as a freelance tech consultant. My daily routine was built around morning time in the garden, coffee at sunrise, 20 minutes of meditation, and then breakfast on the patio before starting work. My clients paid me for problem-solving creativity, which required uninterrupted focus and mental clarity that only came with my morning garden meditation ritual. The space wasn't just aesthetically pleasing, it was functionally essential to my livelihood and well-being. But I began to eat my lunch in the sitting room. Now, workers were trampling my carefully curated native plant beds and running extension cords through my koi pond. The specialized ground cover that had taken months to establish was being crushed under equipment boxes and catering supplies. And at the center of it all stood Karen Whitmore, queen of the HOA, directing the destruction, with the five-star general coordinating a military operation. Her smile never wavered as she systematically dismantled the piece I'd so carefully constructed. Karen Whitmore had been the HOA president for 3 consecutive terms, running unopposed because no one else wanted to deal with the endless complaints, rule enforcement, and neighborhood drama. The position gave her an outsized influence on daily life in our community, and she wielded that power with meticulous precision. In her mid-40s, impeccably highlighted blonde hair always perfectly styled, she carried herself with the unmistakable confidence of someone who had never been told no and wouldn't recognize the word if it slapped her in the face. Her carefully maintained appearance, designer casual clothes, tasteful but expensive jewelry, and that ever-present smile that never quite reached her eyes, projected the image she wanted the world to see: successful, in control, and unimpeachable. Her husband Greg, a mild-mannered accountant, mostly existed in her shadow, nodding along at neighborhood gatherings while she dominated conversations. He was taller than her by almost a foot, but somehow seemed smaller in her presence, his shoulders slightly hunched, as though perpetually bracing for criticism. At community events, he'd drift to the edges of gatherings, nursing the same drink all evening and making brief, apologetic eye contact with whoever Karen was currently lecturing about property standards or community responsibilities. Karen's day job as a real estate agent in the area gave her an outsized interest in maintaining neighborhood standards that helped her sales. Her business cards featured prominently on all community bulletin boards, and she wasn't above using HOA meetings to subtly promote her services, mentioning recent sales in the area or market trends that mysteriously always supported whatever new restrictions she wanted to implement. What most residents understood, but never said aloud, was that Karen's interpretation of HOA rules mysteriously shifted depending on who had crossed her that week. The Taylors, who had employed her as their agent, had a basketball hoop that somehow didn't violate the no sports equipment visible from the street rule. The Johnsons, who had used a competitor, received weekly notices about their non-conforming mailbox until they finally replaced it with one Karen helpfully offered to order for them at cost. I had made the critical error of missing 3 consecutive HOA meetings when I first moved in. In my defense, I'd been in the middle of a major client project and working 14-hour days to meet a deadline. The first meeting coincided with an emergency client call about a system outage. I'd sent a polite email explaining my absence and requesting minutes, which were never provided. The second meeting occurred when I had a high fever, later diagnosed as walking pneumonia from overwork and stress, and could barely leave my bed. By the third meeting, I'd concluded that my attendance was optional since my previous absences had generated no response or follow-up. I discovered how wrong I was when Karen appeared at my door the day after that third missed meeting, clipboard in hand and 2 committee members flanking her like executive assistants. "We've noticed your absence at our mandatory community gatherings," she began without preamble or greeting. "As outlined in Section 5.3 of the HOA bylaws, all homeowners are required to attend or provide proxy representation." She thrust a document toward me, a formal notice of non-compliance that detailed potential fines for continued absence. I was still battling the tail end of pneumonia and barely had energy to stand in the doorway, let alone argue HOA policy. Then I'd compounded my sin by politely declining to join her neighborhood beautification committee, despite her increasingly insistent invitations. The committee, as far as I could tell from neighborhood gossip, was primarily a vehicle for Karen to mandate her aesthetic preferences throughout the community. The commitment apparently involved Saturday morning meetings, volunteer landscaping work at Karen's celebrated properties, and the expectation to report neighbors whose yards didn't meet standards. "I'm afraid I don't have the expertise," I'd explained during her third recruitment attempt, trying to be diplomatic while standing at my front door in work clothes, clearly in the middle of my day, and my work schedule is quite unpredictable. Her smile had frozen for just a moment, a flash of something cold in her eyes that reminded me of predators I'd seen in nature documentaries, the fixed stare before the lunge. "Everyone makes time for what they value, Mark," she'd replied, her tone suggesting she'd just diagnosed a serious character flaw. "Community involvement isn't optional. It's essential to maintaining our property values and neighborhood spirit." She'd glanced pointedly at my modest landscaping. "Perhaps if you join the committee, you could learn the proper standards expected here." With that thinly veiled insult, she'd pirouetted on her designer flats and strode away, phone already in hand. From that point on, I was on her watch list, a status confirmed by the sudden increase in violation notices appearing on my door for increasingly minor infractions. From a mower left visible on my side yard for 2 hours while I took a work call, to a garbage can retrieved 1 hour past the mandated removal time. While I kept my head down and followed rules to avoid conflict, I'd witnessed her campaigns against others. Mrs. Delgado's unapproved mailbox color, though identical to 3 others on the street. The Rodriguez family's basketball hoop removal despite being fully mobile and stored properly, and Mr. Jenkins' forced removal of a small memorial garden for his late wife, deemed inconsistent landscaping. Karen didn't just enforce rules, she seemed to delight in the enforcement itself. At HOA meetings, which I eventually started attending out of self-preservation, she would recount violations with barely concealed satisfaction, as though each citation was a personal victory. Karen approached me now, her heels somehow not sinking into my soft garden soil. "Mark, isn't this wonderful? Greg and I are renewing our vows for our 20th anniversary, and your backyard is the perfect setting. We're so blessed to have such a generous community." Her voice carried just enough volume that several workers turned to watch our interaction, a practiced performance with an audience in mind. Greg stood in the background, looking deeply fascinated by something on his phone several yards away, his body language screaming discomfort. He glanced up briefly, caught my eye, and quickly looked back down, his face reddening slightly. "Karen, I never agreed to this," I said, trying to keep my voice level despite the rage building inside me as I watched a worker accidentally knock over one of my solar lanterns. "This is my private property. You can't just decide to hold an event here." I gestured to the growing disaster around us, my trampled plants, equipment piled on my small patio, workers threading string lights through my trees. A catering truck had arrived and was backing up to my side gate, its engine drowning out the birdsong that usually accompanied my morning coffee. Her smile never faltered, but her eyes hardened to flints, the mask slipping just slightly before she recovered. "Oh, Mark, there's a misunderstanding. The HOA board approved this weeks ago. If you attended meetings, you'd know that this area falls under our community access clause for special events. It's all perfectly above board." She lowered her voice, leaning in slightly. "Besides, it's just for 1 day. Don't be difficult. It doesn't look good to the neighbors. We've all made accommodations for each other. It's your turn to contribute to our community spirit." With that, she turned away, calling out to a worker who was setting up a champagne fountain perilously close to my meditation bench. I retreated inside, seething but unsure how to proceed. My hands shook as I refilled my coffee cup, adrenaline coursing through me with nowhere to go. A quick search through my property documents revealed the horrible truth. There was indeed ambiguity about the exact property line at the back of my lot. When the development had been built in the 1980s, the builder had left some common landscaping access language that had never been clarified. A faded survey map showed dotted lines indicating potential common areas with no precise demarcation. Most homeowners understood the general boundaries of their yards, but technically, the HOA could claim certain portions for community beautification under the right circumstances. Karen had found my vulnerability and was exploiting it with surgical precision. Over the next week, my quiet life dissolved into chaos. Each morning brought new intrusions, workers building a wooden platform directly over my koi pond, drilling into the stonework I'd so carefully arranged. Expensive rental equipment delivered without notice, crushing more plants under heavy crates. A wedding rehearsal disrupting my work calls with their music and laughter. The DJ tested his sound system at maximum volume for acoustics checking, making it impossible for me to conduct business calls. The bass was so loud it rattled my windows and sent my anxious cat hiding under the bed for hours. And, as if to add literal insult to injury, Karen's prissy bichon Frise Barkley repeatedly defecated in what remained of my garden beds while Karen refused to clean up. "He's just a dog, Mark. He doesn't understand property lines," she'd said with a laugh when I pointed it out, not even bothering to pick up the waste as she dragged the yapping menace back to her yard. My carefully cultivated plants were dying from being trampled, garden lights broken, and somehow my water and electricity bills were skyrocketing as workers helped themselves to my utilities without permission. I caught one catering assistant filling multiple coolers from my garden hose. When I questioned him, he shrugged. "Mrs. Whitmore said it was fine." Something about a shared utility easement. Extension cords snaked from my external outlets to power lights, speakers, and even a margarita machine for the rehearsal dinner. Each night I unplugged them. Each morning they reappeared, sometimes connected to different outlets as though playing a game of electrical whack-a-mole. The stress began affecting my work. I missed a client deadline for the first time in my freelance career, forced to send an embarrassing email explaining that unexpected circumstances prevented me from completing the project on time. My sleep suffered as I lay awake plotting increasingly elaborate revenge fantasies, none of which I had the courage to execute. My doctor noted my elevated blood pressure at a checkup, asking if work stress had returned. I laughed bitterly. Not work, home. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd left corporate America to reduce stress, only to find it literally invading my backyard. I tried every reasonable approach. I sent a formal email to the HOA board with my property deed attachments, carefully highlighting the inconsistencies in the boundary claims and requesting an emergency meeting to resolve the issue before the wedding. I received Karen's dismissive response within hours, citing Amendment 7B on shared beautification areas, and noting that the board has already approved this community celebration event. The email ended with a patronizing suggestion that I embrace the opportunity to contribute positively to neighborhood cohesion. No other board members responded, though I'd copied them all. I consulted a lawyer who regretfully informed me, fighting HOAs is expensive and rarely successful, especially with ambiguous property line documentation. He reviewed my paperwork, sucking air through his teeth as he examined the survey maps. "These old developments with unclear boundaries are a nightmare. You could file for an emergency injunction, but honestly, by the time it got through the system, the wedding would be over, and if you lose, you're on the hook for all legal fees." His advice: document everything for potential future action, but otherwise, sometimes it's cheaper to just replace some plants than fight City Hall. Or in this case, I attempted to rally neighbors who sympathized in private but feared Karen's retaliation. "She'll find something wrong with your house, guaranteed," whispered Mrs. Delgado, the 76-year-old widow who lived across the street. Her sharp eyes didn't miss much from her front porch vantage point. Last time I complained about her, suddenly my holiday decorations violated 3 separate bylaws. Despite her fear, she offered valuable information. "She's been using HOA money for this wedding, you know, calling it a community event on the books. My grandson is an accountant. He says that's not legal." I documented the intrusions with time-stamped photos and videos, but with no clear authority to appeal to, I felt increasingly powerless in my own home. The turning point came unexpectedly. I ran into Greg Whitmore at the hardware store while buying supplies to repair some of the damage to my garden. He was in the paint aisle, staring blankly at color swatches, his shoulders slumped in a now familiar posture of defeat. He looked uncomfortable when he saw me, but approached anyway. "Mark?" I want to apologize for all this," he said, glancing around to ensure no one was listening. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "This wasn't my idea." Karen does this to everyone who doesn't play by her rules." He hesitated before adding, "She was particularly upset when you declined to join her beautification committee. Said you thought you were too good for community involvement." He looked genuinely troubled, toying with a paint chip without really seeing it. "This wedding renewal is more about showing off than about us. We're not even having issues. She just wants to outdo the Hendersons' anniversary party last month." I studied Greg's face, seeing the weariness etched in lines around his eyes. How many years had he spent apologizing for his wife's behavior? "Why do you stay with her?" I asked, the question escaping before I could stop it. He gave a small, sad smile. 20 years is a long time. And Karen, she wasn't always like this. Or maybe she was and I just didn't see it." He shrugged. "Doesn't matter now." Greg's confession shifted something in me. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was deliberate targeting. "Is there anything that can be done?" I asked. Greg hesitated before lowering his voice further. "Between us, Karen's used HOA funds to pay for some of this. The board doesn't know." She coded it as community event expenses. "Robert, the treasurer, has concerns, but is too intimidated to question her." He checked his watch. "I should go. She's expecting me home." As he turned to leave, he added, "The wedding's Saturday at 3 p.m. Should be done by 9 if that helps." The meaningful look he gave me suggested he wouldn't be entirely unhappy if something were to disrupt his wife's plans. The final straw came the day before the wedding. I returned home to find workers disconnecting my irrigation system to install the dance floor. The redirected water had caused minor flooding in my basement, damaging boxes of books I'd stored there. When I confronted Karen, her response was breathtaking in its entitlement. "It's just for one day, Mark. Stop being so selfish. The whole neighborhood is looking forward to this." She stood in my ruined garden, phone in hand, taking photos of the transformed space for social media. "This will be the most elegant event our community has ever seen. You should be honored to host it." As I walked away, I overheard her telling a worker, "Mark's yard is perfect payback for him thinking he's too good for our community." That night I sat in my damaged garden, calculating the financial and emotional cost of Karen's vendetta. The plants could be replaced, but my sense of security and peace in my own home, that was harder to restore. Something inside me, perhaps the last of my conflict-avoiding nature, finally snapped. Being nice clearly wasn't working with people like Karen. Sometimes justice required getting your hands dirty. I spent the evening researching local infrastructure and drainage systems, making several calls to friends with relevant expertise. My former college roommate, now working in the city water department, provided invaluable information about our neighborhood's plumbing and septic setup. "These older developments have some quirks," he explained. "When they added the cul-de-sac where your house is, they had to reconfigure some of the main drainage pipes. There's a junction box near your property line that controls flow for several houses." He paused before adding, "Hypothetically speaking, if someone were having drainage issues, that would be the first place a maintenance crew would need to inspect." My research also revealed that Karen had made illegal modifications to the drainage system when installing her pool last year. Modifications that created a critical vulnerability if water flow was, say, redirected during a maintenance procedure. County records showed permits filed but never finalized, with inspections scheduled but mysteriously canceled. I began documenting drainage issues in my home, strategically flushing items at specific times to create minor but noticeable backup problems. I scheduled a legitimate septic cleaning service for an emergency maintenance call, explaining my ongoing concerns about slow drainage and unusual odors. The company was completely legitimate. The timing was my only contribution. The next morning I made a show of packing my car and driving away, giving the impression I'd left town rather than witness the event. In reality, I checked into a small hotel 1 block over with a room that had a perfect view of my backyard. From there, I could see the final transformation of my sanctuary into Karen's showcase. White carpet had been rolled out over my garden paths, 100+ guests in formal attire were arriving, taking selfies in front of my pond. Karen strutted around in an elaborate white designer dress, accepting compliments with practiced humility. The irony wasn't lost on me that she'd chosen white for her renewal ceremony. Purity had never been her strong suit. The ceremony began at precisely 3 p.m., with Karen and Greg standing beneath a floral arch positioned exactly where my favorite meditation spot had been. The minister spoke about renewal and community while Karen beamed for the photographer. Greg stood stiffly beside her, his smile looking more like a grimace. Guests fanned themselves in the afternoon heat as the ceremony dragged on, with Karen apparently having written extensive personal vows. I caught phrases through my binoculars. Ruling our domain with love and creating beauty wherever we go. The hypocrisy was almost as thick as the humidity. As Karen began her vows, something saccharine about ruling her domain with love, I watched a city maintenance truck pull up. Workers in official uniforms approached with clipboards, and I could see Karen attempting to wave them away without disrupting her perfect photo op. But even she couldn't dismiss city officials conducting an emergency inspection. I watched through binoculars as they explained the situation, pointing to areas near where her modifications had compromised the system. The septic cleaning truck arrived as backup for what they deemed a critical situation. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. Karen was mid-sentence about creating harmony when the truck's backup beepers cut through her amplified voice. Greg stood to the side, his subtle smile visible even from my distant vantage point. What happened next exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. The workers began their inspection at strategic drainage points, precisely where I had documented issues. Under the guise of a pressure test, they activated equipment that, due to Karen's illegal modifications, had nowhere to release pressure except up through the very ground her wedding was occupying. It started slowly. Damp patches appearing on the white carpet near the dance floor. Guests shifted uncomfortably, moving their feet. Karen, in the middle of her toast about her perfect day, faltered as she noticed the growing moisture. Then, with a timing I couldn't have planned better, the first major backup erupted directly under the cake table. The chaos was magnificent. Dirty water began steadily seeping up through the ground, gradually flooding the reception area. Guests scrambled to save designer shoes and dresses, abandoning plates of catered food. The white carpet turned a mottled brown as the water spread. Karen's pristine dress became progressively soiled as she ran from worker to worker, demanding they stop whatever was happening. The food and decorations were ruined within minutes, and ironically, Barkley got the worst of it. The little dog ran excitedly through the puddles, completely soaking himself in the mess before jumping on Karen's dress. Through it all, the workers maintained their professional demeanor, showing official documentation about the necessary emergency maintenance that couldn't possibly be rescheduled due to potential environmental hazards. I couldn't resist one final touch. I called Greg's cell phone, which he answered immediately despite the chaos. "I thought this was a shared space," I said, unable to keep the satisfaction from my voice. "Isn't that what the HOA decided?" His laughter was genuine and unrestrained, possibly the first honest emotion I'd ever heard from him in 3 years of living there. "It appears we're having some drainage issues," he replied, loud enough that I imagined Karen could hear him. "Seems there might have been some unauthorized modifications to the system. Funny how these things come back around, isn't it?" Karen's meltdown was spectacular. As guests fled and workers documented the scene for liability purposes, she screamed accusations at everyone: the workers, the guests, Greg, even Barkley. Her carefully constructed facade of community leadership crumbled as she stood in the middle of the muck, mascara running down her face, designer dress ruined, demanding to know who was responsible. "This is sabotage," she shrieked, pointing wildly at the maintenance workers who continued methodically checking pipes and taking notes. "I want names. I want reports. I'll sue the entire department." A few guests tried to console her, but most were hurriedly leaving, expensive shoes in hand, trying to minimize damage to their formal wear. The workers, to their credit, maintained absolute professionalism. The lead technician, a stocky man with salt and pepper hair and the weathered face of someone who had seen it all, calmly explained to Karen that they were responding to an emergency service call about potential sewage contamination. "Ma'am, we understand this is inconvenient, but public health regulations require immediate response to possible septic failures. The paperwork was properly filed," he said, holding up a clipboard with official-looking documents. "We have records indicating non-compliance with previous inspection requirements for drainage modifications at this address." He gestured toward Karen's property. "Unfortunately, those unpermitted modifications appear to have created a pressure imbalance in the system that's causing this backup." Karen's face cycled through several shades of red as she processed this information. "That's impossible. We had all the proper permits." Several guests, who hadn't yet managed to escape, looked uncomfortable at this outburst. The technician simply flipped to another page on his clipboard. "Our records indicate that initial permits were filed, but final inspections were canceled 3 times and never completed. Without final approval, these modifications are considered non-compliant with county regulations." His voice remained steady and matter-of-fact, which seemed to infuriate Karen even more. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Karen demanded, jabbing a manicured finger toward the technician's chest, though careful to avoid actually touching his mud-splattered uniform. "I am the president of this homeowners association. I sell more real estate in this county than anyone else. You can't just show up and ruin the most important day of my life." Her voice cracked on the last words, a mixture of rage and desperation that momentarily silenced the dwindling crowd. The technician's expression never changed. "Yes, ma'am. That information has been noted in the report. We'll need access to the junction box located on this property to prevent further contamination of the surrounding area." Greg finally stood up to her publicly. "You brought this on yourself, Karen. You've bullied everyone for years. Maybe it's time to stop." His voice was quiet but carried in the sudden silence following her tirade. The remaining guests froze, witnessing a seismic shift in dynamics. "I didn't authorize any modifications," Karen hissed at him. "You handled all that paperwork." Greg nodded calmly. "Yes, I did, and I have copies of everything, including the inspection forms you told me you'd submitted but never did." He walked away, leaving her sputtering in the mud. I returned home that evening to survey the aftermath, sitting quietly on my porch with a cup of coffee and the first genuine sense of peace I'd felt in weeks. The community fallout was immediate and decisive. An emergency HOA meeting was called the following Tuesday to address the incident. The community center meeting room was packed, with neighbors who rarely attended suddenly finding time in their schedules for what promised to be the most dramatic gathering in subdivision history. Karen arrived ready to blame everyone but herself, dressed impeccably as though trying to erase the image of her mud-covered meltdown from community memory. But the mood had shifted dramatically. Neighbors who had silently endured her reign of terror for years finally found their voices. Mrs. Delgado presented financial evidence of HOA funds misappropriation that she'd been quietly collecting. "I may be old, but I can read a budget report," she announced, distributing copies of highlighted financial statements showing thousands of dollars classified as community events that coincided perfectly with wedding vendor payments. Robert, the treasurer, confirmed the unauthorized use of funds, his voice shaking slightly. "I should have spoken up sooner, but I was intimidated." He avoided looking directly at Karen. "This is a clear violation of our bylaws and possibly state laws governing HOA fund usage." Multiple homeowners filed complaints about property damage from both the wedding setup and the subsequent flooding. The Rodriguez family presented photos of their children's ruined shoes from walking through the contaminated runoff that had reached their yard. Mr. Jenkins quietly described how the water had carried debris into his late wife's remaining memorial plants, killing the last roses she had planted, and somehow, I can't imagine how, videos of Karen's meltdown had found their way to the community Facebook page, showing her true character to anyone who might have been uncertain. Karen attempted to deflect, claiming she was the real victim. "This was clearly sabotage aimed at me personally. Mark Patterson disappeared conveniently right before the incident. Has anyone questioned him?" All eyes turned to me, sitting quietly in the back row. I stood slowly. I was at the Lakeside Hotel, as several staff members can confirm. I left because I couldn't bear to watch my property being destroyed any further. I've documented over $3,000 in damage to my garden and basement from the wedding preparations alone. I paused. And I have copies of all my communications requesting this event not be held on my property, along with photographic evidence of the damage as it occurred. Greg, sitting separately from Karen for the first time in anyone's memory, cleared his throat. I can also confirm that Karen was aware of potential drainage issues from our pool installation but chose not to complete the required inspections. The room fell silent. Karen's face went through a remarkable transformation: shock, rage, betrayal, and finally, a calculating assessment of her rapidly diminishing options. Karen was forced to resign from her HOA presidency that very night. Robert was elected interim president until proper elections could be held. Karen's real estate business suffered as word spread about her unethical behavior. It turns out potential buyers don't trust agents with questionable ethics. The city fined her substantially for the improper drainage modifications that had unfortunately contributed to the septic incident. She was required to pay restitution for the damages to my property, though no amount could really compensate for the violation I'd felt. Her attempts to blame me backfired spectacularly when all evidence showed only legitimate maintenance calls and documented drainage issues that predated the wedding. The final blow came when Greg quietly moved out 2 weeks later, leaving a brief note on community bulletin board thanking people for their support during this transition period. He'd packed his belongings while Karen was at a damage control lunch with her remaining allies. Neighbors reported seeing him smiling as he drove away, car loaded with just the essentials, looking younger than he had in years. My garden slowly began to heal as I rebuilt my sanctuary. The restoration process was both challenging and cathartic. The first weekend after the disaster, I spent hours just sitting in the damaged space, mentally mapping what could be saved and what needed to be replaced. Some of my native plants had surprisingly survived, their roots intact despite the trampling and flooding. The koi had been rescued and temporarily relocated to a neighbor's pond during the cleanup, but the stonework needed significant repair, where the wedding platform had crushed and displaced carefully positioned rocks. I began with the structural elements, rebuilding the pond edges, resetting the displaced stepping stones, and reinforcing the small retaining wall that had partially collapsed under the weight of the catering equipment. Each stone I placed felt like reclaiming a piece of my territory, my privacy, my peace of mind. I mixed new soil with compost and organic matter, preparing the ground for replanting. The process was therapeutic in the same way the original creation had been, but this time with an added layer of resilience and determination. Surprisingly, several community members volunteered to help replant what had been destroyed. The Rodriguez family brought over seedlings they had started in their greenhouse. "We wanted to show solidarity," Mr. Rodriguez explained while his children carefully placed young plants in the prepared soil. "What happened to you could have happened to any of us who crossed her path." Robert from the HOA brought over several native shrubs. "The association voted to cover some of your landscaping costs," he explained somewhat awkwardly. "It's the least we can do after everything." Mrs. Delgado brought heirloom seeds as a peace offering, varieties she had been cultivating for decades. "My grandmother brought these from her village in Mexico," she explained, showing me the small hand-labeled packets. "They'll bring good energy to your space." She carefully planted marigolds along my pond, her gnarled hands moving with practiced precision despite her arthritis. "I should have stood up to her sooner," she told me as she worked. "We all should have. Fear makes us complicit." She worked with surprising vigor for her age, clearly finding catharsis in the act of restoration. In my 80 years, I've learned that gardens and communities need the same thing: regular tending and occasional pruning of what doesn't belong. Her knowing smile made it clear exactly what pruning she was referring to. Even more surprisingly, 8-year-old Toby from down the street started stopping by after school, curious about gardening and full of questions about the koi fish. "Can they really live for 100 years?" he asked, watching them swim. "My dad says some fish are older than most people." His parents gratefully supported this new interest, relieved to have him away from video games for a few hours. I found myself cautiously engaging with my community in a way I never had before, finding connection without sacrificing the boundaries I needed. The HOA underwent its own transformation. Robert was elected as the new president, focusing on actual community needs rather than petty rule enforcement. The first items on his agenda: clarifying property boundaries and revising the outdated bylaws to prevent future abuse. The ambiguous property line documentation was officially updated with proper surveys, ensuring no homeowner would face a similar situation again. The first neighborhood event under the new leadership was hosted in the community center, with explicit consent from all involved parties. I even agreed to join a scaled-down version of the beautification committee, primarily to ensure no one else would abuse the position as Karen had. "We're thinking of focusing on native plants for the community areas," Robert explained during a committee meeting. "They require less water and maintenance. Mark, would you be willing to advise on that?" It was a small olive branch, but I appreciated the acknowledgement of my expertise. And boundaries. Reg found unexpected happiness after leaving Karen. Within months, he was frequently seen at the local bookstore with its owner, a quiet woman who seemed his perfect match. They held hands and laughed easily together, something I'd never witnessed during his marriage to Karen. He stopped by one day with a gift: rare plant specimens for my garden. "Consider it an apology and thank you all in one," he said, helping me find the perfect spot for the delicate plant. "I've been waiting for a reason to leave for years." When I asked why he'd stayed so long, he shrugged. "Fear of change, I guess. Sometimes it takes a flood to wash away what's not working." We weren't exactly friends, but there was a mutual respect born from shared experience. The for sale sign in front of Karen's empty house remained for months, becoming a silent monument to her downfall. Potential buyers would tour the house, then mysteriously lose interest. Perhaps it was the pool with its recently repaired drainage system, or maybe word had spread about the former owner. Ironically, property values increased under Robert's more reasonable HOA leadership, with several new families moving in who specifically cited the friendly, supportive community as their reason for choosing our neighborhood. In the ultimate twist of fate, Barkley ended up being adopted by Mrs. Delgado when Karen moved away, claiming the condo she'd relocated to didn't allow pets. The little dog, now properly trained, became a neighborhood favorite who never once desecrated my garden beds. Mrs. Delgado and Barkley would take their daily constitutional around the neighborhood, the tiny dog prancing proudly beside the elderly woman who snuck him more treats than was probably advisable. "He just needed proper boundaries," she told me with a wink, "like most of us." As for me, I found my voice and boundaries without becoming bitter. I maintain a healthy balance of privacy and selective community engagement, attending HOA meetings but also protecting my personal time and space. My sister Jessica, who had canceled her visit during the wedding drama, finally came to stay and approved of the changes, both to my garden and my willingness to connect with neighbors. "You seem more at peace," she observed as we shared morning coffee in my restored garden. "More grounded." She was right. There was power in standing up for myself, in finding the perfect balance between accommodation and boundaries. My garden became more beautiful than ever, with the new plants growing vigorously where the old ones had been trampled. The soil, enriched by the unfortunate incident, seemed to support more vibrant growth than before. My koi, thankfully rescued and temporarily housed in Mrs. Delgado's daughter's pond during repairs, returned to their home and thrived, growing larger and more colorful as though celebrating their second chance. In a final ironic twist, I received the Community Beautification Award that fall, the same award Karen had coveted for years but never won due to insufficient community input. The plaque now hangs discreetly near my garden entrance, a small reminder that sometimes justice arrives in unexpected packages. Some people never learn that the stronger the boundary, the better the neighbor, but I suspect Karen understands that now wherever she ended up. As for me, my garden has never bloomed more beautifully than after the storm. The native wildflowers attract butterflies and hummingbirds, creating a living tapestry that changes with the seasons. The sound of the waterfall in my koi pond once again masks neighborhood noise, allowing me the peace I need for my work and well-being. My meditation bench, restored and reinforced, sits in a new spot that catches both morning and afternoon light, giving me options for my daily practice. Last week, I overheard someone new to the neighborhood asking about the wedding disaster during a community picnic. The story has become neighborhood legend, passed down with increasing embellishment. Mrs. Delgado winked at me across the potluck table as Robert quickly changed the subject. Some stories are better left as whispered cautionary tales. Barkley, now elderly but still sprightly, trotted over to me for a scratch behind the ears, his redemption as complete as the garden he once defiled. Sometimes it takes a little dirty water to wash away the truly toxic elements in your life. If you've stayed with my story this long, maybe you have your own Karen who needs a reality check. The trick isn't fighting fire with fire. It's finding the exact right moment when their own actions create the perfect storm, and then, just maybe, stepping back and letting nature take its course.